Every summer, my friends and I go on a camping trip. It's a tradition, just a weekend of hiking, fishing, and sitting around a campfire, away from work, phones, and responsibilities. Last year, though, something happened that none of us can explain, and we haven't gone back since. There were 4 of us: me, Jake, Marcus, and Ben. We decided to camp at Clearwater Forest, a remote area with thick woods and very few other campers. We had picked a spot about 4 miles from the nearest road, near a small creek, surrounded by towering pines. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and untouched. The first day was normal. We set up camp, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon fishing. As the sun set, we cooked our catch over the fire, had a few drinks, and told dumb stories like we always did. But as night fell, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional breeze rustling the trees. At one point, Ben joked, "It's like everything out here's scared of something." We all laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. We had 2 tents, Jake and I in one, Marcus and Ben in the other. The fire had burned down to glowing embers as we zipped up our tents and settled in for the night. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had completely died out, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the trees. I listened, expecting to hear someone moving in their sleeping bag, or maybe an animal in the distance. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not heavy, like a bear or a deer, but light, careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. I held my breath, listening. The steps came closer, stopping just outside our tent. I nudged Jake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He mumbled something in his sleep and rolled over. Then the footsteps started again, circling our tent. My heart was pounding. I wanted to say something, but a primal instinct told me to stay quiet. I reached for my flashlight, but just as I clicked it on, the footsteps stopped. I held the light against the fabric of the tent, expecting to see a shadow. But there was nothing. Just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find Marcus and Ben already up, making coffee. Before I could say anything, Ben said, "You guys were walking around last night, right?" I froze. "No. We thought it was you." Marcus shook his head. The 4 of us just stood there for a moment, staring at each other. Then Jake shrugged it off. "Probably an animal." I wanted to believe that. I really did. The second day went by without incident. We hiked, swam in the creek, and tried to forget about the night before. As darkness fell, we built the fire bigger than before and kept our flashlights within reach. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me up. It was whispering. I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like multiple voices, too low and fast to understand. I sat up, my body cold with fear. It was coming from the trees. I nudged Jake awake again, whispering, "Do you hear that?" This time, he did. His eyes widened, and he mouthed something, but no words came out. We both sat there, frozen. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they got closer. Suddenly, from the other tent, Marcus shouted, "Who's out there?" The whispers immediately stopped. Then, a branch snapped. Something big moved just beyond the firelight. Jake unzipped the tent, shining his flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Marcus and Ben came stumbling out of their tent, both looking as freaked out as we felt. We stood by the dying fire, scanning the tree line. But there was nothing there. No movement. No sounds. We didn't sleep after that. At dawn, we packed up as fast as we could. None of us talked much. We just wanted to get the hell out of there, As we were leaving, I glanced back at our campsite one last time. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not ours. They were barefoot, large, and led from the trees directly to our tents. I never went camping in Clearwater Forest again, and I don't think I ever will. I've always loved the woods. There's something about the solitude, the crisp scent of pine, and the way the world just stops when you step deep enough into nature. That's why I took up solo hiking. I'd spend entire weekends out there, miles from anyone, just me and the wild. But after what happened last fall, I haven't stepped foot in the woods since. I had taken a few days off work to camp in Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. It was October, the perfect time of year, cool and quiet. My plan was simple. Hike in about 17 miles, set up camp by a small lake I'd been to before, and just enjoy the peace. The first day was perfect. The trail was empty, the air was fresh, and the autumn leaves turned the entire forest into a golden dream. I reached my spot by late afternoon, set up camp, and made a small fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. The lake reflected the moonlight beautifully, and for a while, I just sat there, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Then, around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and my tent was still zipped shut. But something felt off. Then I heard it. A long, slow whistle. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was a perfect human-like whistle, coming from somewhere deep in the trees. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whistle came again, slow, deliberate, maybe 20 yards away. Then silence. I told myself it was another camper, though I hadn't seen a single person all day. Maybe a hiker passing through. That made sense, right? I stayed awake for another hour, gripping the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, everything felt normal again. Sunlight streamed through the trees, birds chirped, and the still lake looked just as peaceful as before. I convinced myself I'd imagined the whistle in that half-awake state between sleep and consciousness. But then, as I was packing up to hike further in, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. They were large, barefoot, and circled my entire camp. I hadn't heard them. Not a single sound. I should have left right then. But I was deep in the woods, miles from my truck, and I didn't want to psych myself out. I decided I'd finish my planned hike, but I'd be extra cautious. By late afternoon, I reached an abandoned fire tower marked on my map. It was old, probably condemned, but I figured it would give me a great vantage point of the surrounding forest. I climbed the rickety steps and looked out over the endless stretch of trees. The view was breathtaking. But then, my eyes caught something moving at the tree line far below. A figure. It was just standing there. Too far to make out any details, but the way it stood sent a sickening chill through me. It wasn't moving, just standing, facing the fire tower, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the way the shadows moved. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I set up camp again, this time without a fire. I wanted to stay hidden. I barely slept. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, set my nerves on edge. Then, sometime in the early morning hours, I heard breathing, right outside my tent. Long, slow, heavy. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My hand gripped my knife so tightly it hurt. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, a single tap on my tent wall. My body went ice cold. Then, another tap. Then another. slow, deliberate, right beside my head. I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged for my flashlight and flicked it on. Nothing. The sound had stopped. No movement. No footsteps. But I felt something there. Watching. I sat there, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn. Then I packed my things and ran. I hiked faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe easy until I was back in my truck, the engine roaring to life. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there, standing at the tree line, was a figure. Still. Watching. I haven't been back since. I've always been comfortable in the wilderness. Growing up in Montana, I spent more nights under the stars than in my own bed. Hunting, fishing, and hiking were second nature to me. So, when my cousin Mark invited me to his family's remote cabin deep in the Lolo National Forest for a solo hunting trip, I jumped at the opportunity. It was early November, the air crisp and still. Mark was supposed to meet me the next evening, so I had a full night alone. I relished the idea. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I parked my truck about a half-mile from the cabin, loaded my rifle, and trekked in. The cabin was old but sturdy, a one-room structure with a loft. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, an old bed, and a hunting rifle rack. A fresh dusting of snow covered the ground, and the fading light cast long, creeping shadows through the towering pines. I set up a lantern, cooked some beans over the stove, and settled in with a flask of whiskey. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it. A high-pitched whistle. Not an owl. Not the wind. Something off. It came from the woods, maybe 50 yards away. Long, slow, deliberate. Then silence. I froze, my pulse pounding. I've heard elk bugling, coyotes yipping, even mountain lions screaming. But this was different. It sounded almost human. I shook it off. The mind plays tricks in the dark. I banked the fire, climbed into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. Then, crunch, a footstep, close, too close. I sat up, heart hammering, and grabbed my rifle. The lantern still flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. I strained to listen. Silence. Nothing but my own ragged breathing. I told myself it was a deer. Maybe a bear. I laid back down, clutching the rifle to my chest. But sleep wouldn't come. Hours passed, and at some point I must have dozed off because I woke to something worse. Tapping. Right outside the cabin. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. On the wooden wall, just beside the door. I stopped breathing. The tapping continued. 7 beats, then silence. 7 beats, then silence. Like it was waiting for something. I crept from my bed and pressed my ear to the wood. My fingers trembled around my rifle. My breath came out in short, sharp gasps. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but the pattern was too perfect, too calculated. Then, a whisper. Low, unintelligible, right outside. Something was out there. I did the only thing I could think of. I raised my rifle, stepped toward the door, and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the vast, empty woods. The snow-covered ground stretched in every direction, undisturbed. No prints. No movement. Only the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat in the corner of the room with my rifle aimed at the entrance. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed up and got the hell out of there. I didn't wait for Mark. I didn't care if it made me look foolish. I drove home, white-knuckled, and didn't say a word to anyone for days. But here's the thing that still haunts me. When Mark finally called, he was furious. "Why'd you leave the cabin unlocked, man?" he asked. "I didn't," I told him. "I locked it when I left." There was a long pause. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "The door was open when I got there, and Someone carved something into the wall. "What?" I whispered. Another long pause. Then, barely above a breath, he said, "7 marks. Right next to the door." I never went back.